So for this week, we're going to focus on three authors. Two of those authors, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to get a fantastic read from these two authors. But I want us to have a conversation about these two authors and just to discuss if you think that there are fantastic elements in these authors' works. Along with the three authors that I have us reading for this semester, for this week, I should say, I also provided you all a list of literary terms that I want you to familiarize yourself with. These literary terms will help you get a better understanding of analyzing the literature that you're reading, and I also want you to start incorporating these terms in your discussion posts, and I would hope for you to incorporate these terms in your final paper. So the three of the authors that we're reading this week, the first one, Gabriel Marquez, writes The Man with Enormous Rings. And we'll see that that story has many fantastic elements in it, and this story is kind of written in the context of magical realism. So when you read this story, I want you to think to yourself, at what point in the story are you forced to challenge your concept of the old man? Is he an angel? Isn't he? Is he not an angel? At what point in the story do you ask yourself this? And at what point in the story do you start to reassess your concept of reality for the sake of this particular character? The next two stories, Ralph Ellison's The Battle Royal and Jack London's To Build a Fire, um, these two stories are a little bit more naturalistic and realistic in their approach. Ralph Ellison's story was written in 1952, and it's part of a larger novel known as Invisible Man. And Jack London's short story was written in 1910. And Jack London's story dealt with this idea of nature and the environment, and how nature and the environment can take an active role in the characterization of people in his story. Also, and when we think about Ralph Ellison and we think about this idea of nature, how is the main character's environment shape his identity and who he is? I also gave you guys another reading piece written by Terry Heller. And Terry Heller writes an analysis on the fantastic. And what he does in his introduction, I have you guys reading the introduction for this week. In his introduction, he talks about the fantastic as being this this form of narrative. So he uses Walt Whitman's poem "Crossing the Brooklyn Ferry," and he illustrates how Walt Whitman is able to, in his words, compromise the aesthetic space between the reader and the writer. So it's this idea, it's this compromising the aesthetic space between the reader and the writer is just this fancy way of saying the writer being able to identify with the reader. Okay? So it's these moments in the narrative when it's this perfect form of communication between the author and the reader that Terry Heller describes in his introduction to In the Delights of Terror. So I want you to think about that in terms of the cultural background of Ralph Ellison. I want you to think about that in the terms of the cultural background in Jack London and Gabriel Marquez. And I want you to think about how they write their stories. I want you to think about who their audience is. And I want you to think about the language that they use to identify their audience. And if these writers are writing about these particular episodes and they are able to communicate this pure form of identification between their reader, then Terry Heller would suggest that that's a form of the fantastic. So I want you to keep these things in mind as you read these three stories, and I also want you to continue to read Slaughterhouse-Five. Hopefully by the end of this week you'll be read up through chapter 6. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. My office hours again, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, here at Delta College from 1 to 3. And if you have any questions, send me an email. And I'll let you guys know in terms of the tutorial as well. I want to set up a tutorial for everyone, just to, if you want a chance to meet with me face to face, to talk about your final paper, if you want to talk about the story some more. Right now, I have gotten replies back from a few of you who said that Monday after 5 o'clock on campus is the best. So look for an email from me to let you guys know when that would take place on Monday. Probably be sometime around 6 o'clock here on Delta College's campus, and I'll send you guys an email to let you know the room. Okay? So again, if you have any questions, let me know. I want you to keep these things in mind as you're reading these stories from Marquez, Ellison, and London. I want you to think about this concept of naturalism. I want you to think about the time period in which they wrote these stories. Again, Marquez writes his story in 1968. Ellison writes his story in 1952, and London writes his story in 1910. So keep in mind the dates, the time period in which these writers write these stories. I want you to ask yourself, do these stories have fantastic elements in them? If they do, why do you think they have these fantastic elements? If they don't, why not? Is it because they're too naturalistic? Is it because they're too realistic and they don't have room for fantastic, magical, realist elements? Okay? So these are some of the things I want you to think about as you read these stories. Happy reading, everyone. Of course, again, if you have questions, please let me know.